They struggle to earn enough to put food on the table, and now they're stranded without a home. In the southernmost fringes of Beijing, these Chinese migrant workers have less than a day to pack up their belongings in their small flats and leave. Meanwhile, bulldozers move to destroy the buildings that housed them just hours ago. Police stand guard to make sure the work gets done without disruption. Shocked and helpless, the migrants find it hard to understand these evictions.
How am I feeling? We're all very angry. We say we're also Chinese. Why do you treat us like this? It's not like we are foreigners. We are also Chinese.
Beijing says it's stepping up a crackdown on buildings that break fire and safety rules. The enforcement was triggered by an apartment fire earlier this month that killed 19 people. Almost all of them were migrants. Many of these buildings offer cheap rents and are the only housing option the migrants can afford. But it's not just their homes that are being destroyed. Authorities are also emptying out nearby supermarkets and produce stores, leaving them with no shelter or food. According to a 2016 report by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, almost 40% of Beijing's 22 million residents came from outside the capital. In September, the central government gave approval for Beijing to cap its population at 23 million by 2020. Human rights groups say the evictions are harsh tactics to work towards that plan.
The Chinese government wants a greater freedom of movement for migrant workers into these smaller cities, maybe even provincial capitals, but they really want to restrict movement into the major cities like Beijing, Shanghai and Guangzhou because they fear they simply won't be able to cope with the influx.
Non-profit groups reaching out to migrants online say their messages have been removed by government censors, while a community service center was shut down by police for offering to shelter the migrants.
I spent all my money on this building, and I still owe others more than $30,000. Where should I go? All I can do is stay here and wait to die.
With nowhere to go, many like Lynn fear that this is just the beginning. Laila Humairah, TRT World.
Chris Torrens is a senior partner at the consulting firm Control Risks, and he joins us now from London. Chris, great to have you on the show. Give us an idea of how important migrant labour is to China's big cities.
Well, migrant labour has helped to drive the Chinese economy for the last 30 years. There are something like 270, 280 million people who've moved from the countryside to largely the coastal cities over those last 3 decades. And they've been absolutely vital in helping to drive the economy, chiefly through construction, so helping to build all the new buildings, the new highways, to contribute to the infrastructure development down the eastern seaboard. They have naturally flocked to those areas where the growth is greatest, so Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen in the south. And we've seen literally almost tens of millions of people go to each of those cities. So the population in Shanghai is something like, the migrant population is something like 7 million people. So naturally it's boosted the city populations and put a lot of pressure on the social infrastructure in those cities.
Right. China has been trying for several years to move itself up the economic value chain. And in that process, I suppose, it needs fewer unskilled workers and more skilled workers. When it comes to these kinds of evictions, are we seeing the social fallout from that economic policy?
Yes, to an extent. It's true that China it's come a huge way over the last 30 years, and it's done that by relying on perhaps the more basic elements of economic growth. So it's all been about export processing, it's been about assembly, and fairly basic elements of economic growth. And what it's been trying to do recently is to innovate more, and as you said, to raise its economy up the value chain. And inevitably that needs a different workforce, I suppose, a different group of skilled labour. But I think that actually can coexist alongside the migrant population that we see. The challenge facing the Chinese government is that many of these migrant workers, as I said, have flocked to the areas where they believe the growth to be greatest. But as that growth begins to flatten out and the economy becomes more focused on value and on innovation, so these resources are actually needed in other parts of the country, perhaps in other cities which have not yet reached the levels that Beijing, Shanghai and Shenzhen have done.
Right. The other factor in all of this, of course, is rising land prices and rising property prices. Yeah. How much of a factor is that in the government's incentive to move these people off these lands?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely, it's a factor, and this isn't just unique to China. We've seen cities in other parts of the world reclaim land that has been residential, as it were, and look to put it to more, what they would say, perceive as more profitable use in other areas. So obviously, as land prices have risen sharply in Beijing over the last 5, 10, 15 years, we've seen a lot of the populations downtown forced to move out and relocated in other areas. What is alarming, I think, or of concern in this particular case is that many of the evictions and the demolitions were taking place on the outskirts. I mean, we have seen people forced to relocate away from areas which are actually near the central business district in downtown Beijing. But some of these evictions are taking place almost out of town on the outskirts, and one would hope that the local authorities are going to be able to put in place better accommodation, even if it isn't downtown, but within reach of the capital.
Right, Chris, we're almost out of time, but one final question now. China's also facing many other challenges, including things like pollution, rising debt levels. Are we likely to see an even tougher set of socio-economic policies from Xi Jinping in 2018 as a result of all of these things?
I think the government will continue to push in terms of trying to enforce tougher environmental restrictions. Obviously, they're concerned about local debt as well. And I think they'll continue to try to narrow the gap between basically the urban rich and the rural poor. But these are all challenges that governments in emerging markets have faced elsewhere. So I think we will see more pressure on that. But still, the potential for the market is absolutely huge, and for foreign investment, it's absolutely huge.
Chris Torrens of Control Risks, thank you very much indeed for your time.